We have Regina Smith, Jeremy Morris, and Andrey Semenov, and they will be followed by Margarita Zavadskaya, who will be giving her comments to the speakers. So Regina, Jeremy, and Andrey will talk about the project that is coming out later this year as an edited volume, and their title today, as is part of the book, title is Varieties of Russian Activism Today. So they will start with focusing on what they found and how they framed the analysis of activism and protest within this particular project, each from a different angle that Regina will soon explain and tell you more about. And then very, very briefly introducing all of our speakers before letting them to start. So Regina Smith is Professor of Political Science at Indiana University and current academic here is Wilson Center Fellow also. And I guess many of you know her most recent book has just come out last autumn, titled Elections, Protests, and Autocratic Regime Stability, Russia 2008 to 2020. And her specialty is, among other topics, elections, protests, and legislative decision-making. And Jeremy Morris is Associate Professor in Global Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark. And his latest book is Everyday Post-Socialism, Working Class Communities in the Russian Margins. And perhaps some of you are familiar with his academic blog about Russia. I think we can put it in the chat, or you can see it in the speaker bios. And Andrey Semenov is Associate Professor of Political Science and Senior Researcher at the Center for Comparative History and Politics at Perm State University in Russia. And his research interests are mobilization, opposition, and civic activism in Russia. And Margarita Zavadskaya will be sharing her insights and comments as well. Is a postdoctoral researcher at the Aleksanteri Institute, and she works on several projects on electoral malpractice. Okay, so that's all from me at the moment, and now I give the floor to the actual speakers. And so, Regina, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Donna, and thank you all for being here and joining the discussion. I'm in Washington, D.C. this year, where I think we could have a very interesting comparative discussion of different types of urban activism. It's been quite a couple of weeks. This project that we're going to talk about today actually has its germ at Aleksanteri, so it's great that we're back here to talk about it. Jeremy and I were fellows in a long time ago in 2013. And we found that we were working from very different foundations, using very different languages to understand the dynamics of everyday life in Russia. And we hotly debated the connection between social dynamics and political behavior and attitudes, where we disagreed profoundly, with Jeremy arguing that there was almost no connection and me arguing that they were intimately connected. And through this project, I think we start to get at what those connections look like. The project crystallized when Andrey invited me to Perm to talk about activism or revolution and presented his own data, really unique data about activism in the regions. The project, as it was conceived, as it emerged out of these discussions, had a few goals. The first was to bring the debates emerging from Russia and European scholarship about bottom-up change or social change into the US discussion, which tends to focus only on formal institutions and top-down, not only, but largely. We also wanted to bring in a range of disciplinary frameworks and theories to bear on individual case studies of activism, to see if sort of dipping in and surveying different actions could give us a broader sense of what was happening. In particular, we wanted to think about emerging social capacity for collective action around issues that are very close to home, and to understand the meaning of non-political action in the Russian context. And we wanted finally to build an interdisciplinary network linking scholars in Europe, Russia, and US around these issues of social dynamics and activism. And that project's still underway. And I'm this spring looking for new ways to connect us and keep us in touch. And if you'd like to join us, please let us know. Our work was unique. We started with a conference where participants brought proto papers and presented them for commentary and discussion at a couple days event. They then went back and developed full papers, which we presented on 3 panels at ACs with outside discussion in order to try to get new voices into our work. Papers were revised again, and the book is now under review at IE Press. We're especially happy to be discussing this work today at Aleksanteri because we're at a moment where we have another shot at revision, so Q&A is hugely valuable. The book itself is organized into 3 sections that vary in their stress or focus, but are really overlapping. The first section looks at the building blocks of activism. The second, the resulting societal organization and collective action. And the final section highlights the different role of state institutions as incentives or disincentive structures. The volume itself, aside from the intro and conclusion, which Jeremy, Andrey, and I wrote together, includes 11 relatively brief case study chapters written by 19 co-authors, so several teams. And the structure of the book is designed to both introduce the reader to important issue areas, but also, as I said before, to collect our thinking about this phenomena of activism. The chapters focus on cases of preservation of non-Russian identity, the Moscow housing project, the Russian Orthodox Church and social welfare provision, labor mobilization, the construction of a skate park, and activism around urban planning processes. Our concluding chapter considers the case of the Navalny presidential campaign organization, and so is particularly relevant today. And Andrey is an author on that team and can contribute to the discussion. Not by plan, but by a happy accident, we often have 2 chapters dealing with similar issues, but from very different perspectives and through different distinct lenses. So it achieves this goal of creating dialogue. And I'm gonna, in just a minute here, attach, hold on one second. This is where I fail with the technology. I'm gonna attach the plan of the book in the chat so you can get a sense of what the chapters look like. So I'm very happy to say that many of our authors are here, some of which whom I didn't know were here. I just saw Anna Delkachuk, Katie Stewart, Guzel Yusupova, John Burgess, Anna Zhelnina, if she's not here, that she would join when she could, Carola Neugebberger, and others are here for a Q&A. So I look forward to this discussion, and I'm gonna stop there and let Jeremy talk about our approach and framework as we outlined it in the introduction.
Okay, thank you, Regina. So I'll start with some of the kind of overriding conceptual kind of prompts and questions that led us to this project and that we kind of kept in our heads when we were trying to frame these case studies and working with our authors. And I guess for this particular audience, which is a pretty sophisticated audience, our first point of departure is probably something that you yourself have already long considered, which is that it's not enough. It's wrong to say that Russian society is either passive, that is, content with the strong leadership of President Putin, or alternatively, that societal action only really takes place according to prompts from above. So the power vertical, but in a kind of societal action perspective. So we try and frame all of our cases in a way that makes it very clear that we, that we are a long way, I think, now from looking at Russian society as passive and atomized as well. That's also wrong. So to do that, we start from the kind of micro level, and as Regina said, we have three parts with overlap. They don't perfectly neatly divide, but the first part, very broadly, is more focusing on the individual, communication between individuals, and kind of how groups of individuals then build networks that can potentially then later lead to kind of a more classical perception of conception of activism. So to go into a bit more detail, yeah, just to reiterate the point about passivity. One thing that we found inspirational was Sarafutinova's recent reflection on that. That is how we, as Russia scholars, as political science scholars, and other scholars, we need to, at a minimum, we owe as intellectuals, we owe the public a degree of self-reflection to avoid turning their disappointment with the absence of democratic change in Russia into a suggestion that change is not possible. Okay, particularly, and we still see this particularly in the media, that there is a particular political subjectivity of passivity in Russia. So that's again from Sarafutinova's point. And so our book really is kind of bearing witness to the way that even since 2011, 12, 13, and the for fair election protests that are very much now back in the frame because of what's happening right now with Navalny. Even in the last 10 years, Russia has changed enormously for the better, even at the same time as becoming more coercive and autocratic in many ways. And that's, I think, what we try and bring out, that organization, activism, and awareness and communication has become more and more sophisticated, right? So Andrey, I think in a few minutes, will pick up on something that we talk about a little bit in our introduction, which is his and his colleagues' collection of an important data set on trying to measure contagious politics in Russia and the degree to which it is urban. So I will let him talk about that in a few minutes. I'll now try then, and very, very briefly, just in 4 or 5 minutes, try and draw out some of the further conceptual framings that we use. And the first one, as pertains to this kind of micro level individual's perspective, that kind of comes before activism proper, is inspired by James C. Scott's work, which is quite old now, on infra-politics, the infra-political. And that ties, I think, quite nicely with something that Regina already mentioned, which is how much informal organizing, informal low-level practices there are in Russia that are quite often ignored or invisible if we apply existing kind of methodologies, particularly political methodologies, right? Whether that's survey data or elite interviews. And one thing again that I think Andrey will be able to talk about is how he is particularly interested in measuring grassroots activism So the infrapolitical after James C. Scott is one of our starting points, and frames the first volume, the first part of the volume. So we have chapters by Regina McCann and Hitchcock on the apartment block campaigning, but really focusing in on how networks of trust and reciprocity among neighbors are built, right? They serve as a foundation. We also have chapters by Stewart and Yusupova on culture and identity as a kind of preliminary space of building activism, focusing on places like Karelia and Tatarstan. So that's really the first part, if I can kind of very, very roughly summarize. So through a process of network building, we have the emergence of activist entrepreneurs who are then able to provide a framework for further action, for more coherent action without endangering individual participants. The second volume then, the second part of the volume builds on that foundation to explore the emergence of more visible action, so protests proper, but of course not just protests. When we're talking about activism, we're talking about petitions and wider NGO or non-governmental organization actions and organizations. So we are interested in how this emerges from shared grievances, common knowledge, identities, and the networks that are built through the infrapolitical, again, as I mentioned via Scott. In that second section, we remark on how often this is prompted by not necessarily the political, but shortcomings in relation to society's expectations of the state. Okay, so again, I mean, a lot of the mobilizations are interesting in that they're characterized by participants themselves as apolitical. We might dispute that and say, well, any kind of mobilization that is based on grievances, societal grievances, is by its very nature political, but that's perhaps something for further discussion. So we have chapters on grassroots activism within the Orthodox Church by John Burgess, who's here today. We have Anna Zhelina's work on housing activism, so a slightly different perspective from Regina and her colleagues. A kind of Anna, I'm sure, is also will talk about her own approach, and then Anna Dekalchuk and Ivan Grigoriev on, as Regina mentioned, the kind of very gradual building blocks of activism among avowedly apolitical youth who want to build a skate park in Sosnovy Bor near St. Petersburg. And then I have a chapter on labor activism and learning. So again, I mean, I don't want to go on about my own chapter, but one thing I think that links a lot of these chapters is how activism, we don't want to look at activism just as one-off events, just as these, mediatized and quite problematically presented in terms of violence and confrontation, as we see with the Navalny protests, so that the casual viewer, the casual observer, can kind of fall into the trap of thinking about these in terms of personalistic politics, as we do with the Navalny, or again, as one-off, sporadic, spontaneous events, right? Of course, those exist, right? But one thing we're interested in this book is long-term learning through communication, through false starts, through failure. So again, one thing I've reflected on is, and not only I, but also another chapter that is on labor protest, on failure of trade unions, for example, and how people learn from those mistakes. Again, linked to learning, of course, is resources. So we've already talked about communication, network building as aspects of resource building. But again, as I said, long-term learning process, the longue durée of activism that stretches back, over 30 years now. In fact, if we're just thinking about the Russian context. So this second section kind of builds on the micro building blocks of activism to look at a kind of intermediary or meso level of more palpable, visible structures, including protests. Then the third, and I'll finish in just a moment because I think Andrey will have a lot to say. He was kind of curating, we each curated a section, and Andrey curated the last section, which is a more organizational governance perspective, I would say. Looking at how sustained mobilization, how mobilization is sustained through enduring organization. And of course, one of the main foci here is Navalny's presidential electoral campaign. But of course, that also does not exist in a vacuum. Again, if we want to talk about the Navalny phenomenon, this is a very, very long process of gestation, involving many, many twists and turns. And again, in Navalny's case, clear organizational learning and development. So depth, strength of organization, sophistication of organization and urban activism. As I said, learning, resources, communication, networks, all based on the infrapolitical set of widely shared grievances that we can observe in Russian society for a long time. Also, if we have time, perhaps we'll get into this thorny question of state and society, right? And so how for a long time there's been, again, we can, even despite ourselves, fall into an oversimplistic perspective that says, well, there is opposition and there is the state. There is, the ruling elite, and there is a disenfranchised mass. So not all of our work, but some of it tries to get into this question of how, well, actually, a lot of the time urban activism and even oppositional activists are in a form of negotiation with the state, and that bureaucrats, street level bureaucrats, this is something that I work on a lot in my own work, they are part of society, they have different political allegiances. And this comes out quite well in some of our chapters, that we cannot kind of easily detach state and society anymore, if that was ever possible, in looking at sociopolitical phenomena in Russia. So that's, I talked for a long time, so I'll stop there and hand over to Andrey, I think.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, let me start by saying that it has been a fascinating experience working with the authors, with their perspectives, and with the wealthiest of data, of the methodology techniques that we all use in this book project. And I think this diversity is the major sort of advantage of the book. Also, it makes my job of summarizing or trying to summarize everything hard. But yeah, well, let's see that. I guess one of the questions that I might have expected from the auditor is that whether it matters to study and to read about local or urban activism in states like Russia, whether it matters to understand, the policy and the politics of the authoritarian states like Russia better if we'll focus, if we'll zoom in to the local activism. And I guess our sort of project directly responds to this question with a direct yes, because after all, local politics does bring some empirical, theoretical insights into the Russian politics, but also to the larger array of authoritarian politics as well. I guess I'll try to summarize our not findings, but some interesting points on 3 tracks, like in terms of methodology, theory and evidence, and policy. In terms of methodology, I guess Jeremy already started talking about that. We have a diversity of perspectives, which we try to pull together and sort of work out the language. I guess in some sense we failed to have a totally comprehensive framework or language, but I think there are at least 2 benefits in this book. And two arguments in this book that we can bring to the table discussing the methodology of social sciences research. One is that local politics is very much suitable for the research because it's directly observable and tractable. And we can see how actually the case studies, the process tracing techniques that and small n comparison that our authors use, they help to unfold a very complex relationships between the actors. My favorite chapters, for instance, in this regard, is Ivan Grigoriev and Anna Dikalchuk's study of skater park activism in Sosnovy Bor in Leningrad Oblast. They show actually that over a long period of time, there was a complex and dynamic relationships between activists, the city dwellers, the administration, the business groups, and the NGOs unfolding over time, where again the state agents acted not as the constraints, but sometimes as constraints, sometimes as enablers. And it is not possible to do that at the large-scale mobilization, nationwide mobilization, with the details, with the granularity that comes with the local cases, like again the skater park activism and others in our books. So I think this is an important contribution to our scholarship in terms of methodology. That again we stress that it is a benefit of tractability and observability that local politics allows us to do. And the other thing I think is that it also sort of speaks to this pretty much buzzword of multidisciplinarity. We have anthropologists, ethnographers, sociologists, political scientists, folks, and even urban policy practitioners / theorists in the book that sort of, I guess, was beneficial for all of us. Rarely there is this wide dialogue between these disciplines. And although, again, I think we might have failed to sort of develop a comprehensive, or it couldn't happen after all at all. But I think there is some vibrant dialogue between these disciplines in our book that also those interested might find helpful in their own research. In terms of theory, I guess Jeremy has already started talking about some interesting points that we've already developed, or our contributors developed in their own chapters. And there are many interesting findings in different areas, again, like urban studies or anthropology of religion or cultural anthropology, political science, and mobilization. But I guess for me, at least from my perspective, we have at least 4 major theoretical contributions to the social sciences and fields like urban mobilization, urban social movements, and social activism. One is that we bring to the table the idea that, again, urbanization still matters. It has been a neglected idea for quite a while because, again, urbanization is connected to the modernization theory, which is not very favorable at the moment. But I guess, as we show in some of the chapters, the process of rebuilding the cities in settings like post-Soviet Russia is an important process where different actors, again, local activists, state actors, they come together, they interact, and urban development becomes an area, a political arena for interactions, for contestation and redeveloping of the state-society relations. And again, for those interested, they might read Carola Nagelbauer chapter on urban development activism in one in Perm, or Eleonora Minaeva's chapter on policy transfers and policy diffusion in Russia. The second point is that, again, as Jeremy mentioned, we also bring back the idea that even in the states, in the authoritarian regimes that look very much solid and uncontestable over time, on the very local level, the state-society relations are in the constant flux. As we show with the both quantitative and qualitative examples, the local activism, the social activism on the local level is an arena for state-society relations in terms of sort of developing the rules of the game and trying to erect the boundaries between state and society. And this is the place where actually society sort of fights back, strikes back against the state's intervention, again the state's attempts to regulate, to constrain, to impose some constraints on the social activities. At times it looks like that the Putin's regime is very much solid and very much unchangeable, but we show that in other cases that state agents, for instance, they might very much constrain the social activism, but at times they act as the helpers, as the enablers, as those who attempt to help the activists, and or at other times they are arbiters and they're trying to stay neutral at these relationships. So this is the second major point that we're trying to develop and make in the book. And the third one is that, again, why local politics, why local activism matters, is that actually it is intimately connected to the national politics as well. We see, for instance, that local politics breeds the political leadership, and Navalny is one of the cases. He started as the activism, as a Yabloko party member and a member of Committee in Defense of the Moscovites, and then developed to the national level. But I also know that in other cases, and some of you here studied that as well, that this is the local level where actually the political leadership emerges and then maybe transferred to the other levels of society. The other thing is that we also emphasize in some of the chapters and in conclusion that there is this transfer of resources between different strands of local contention, say between cultural and language contention and urban development contention. So the activisms on the ground can come back and forth, can use different repertoire, and can use different resources, and they might engage in other arenas for contestation. So again, environmental activism helping social activists, or some social entrepreneurs, like in the study of churches, can bring some, which John introduces, they bring some of the ideas from the urban settings to the rural settings. So there is this constant interest in transfer of resources between the geographical areas, between different strands of activism. And I think it's a very interesting area for the further research as well. And lastly, I think what we also trying to empathize is that also this is the very local level where there is this innovation in repertoire. Again, the authoritarian settings like Russia under Putin restricts the many arenas for political actions, elections, legislators, parties, etc. We know that all of these institutional arenas have been constrained since Putin took office in 2000. But then it is very much the social activism that brings interesting, innovative actions. The actions, the coordination of labor unions on Telegram, of sort of labor activism on Telegram, or engaging in social media with the contesting the language policy. So all of this points to the fact that there is this is the tactical and repertoire innovation at the fringes of political sphere that helps to bring to foster maybe a necessary capital for the further political level contestation. Well, we're not saying that the state here is weak and sort of irresponsive. On the opposite, other chapters show, like Irina Meyer-Olympieva chapter shows that state is pretty much effective in constraining the social activism when it comes, for instance, to labor and cooptation of independent labor unions. But at other times, activism actually are pretty much innovative and pretty much creative in how they use different resources and their knowledge about the opportunities and constraints in one area and transfer it to the other and develop new repertoire, etc. Lastly, in terms of policy, I think we also might have a nice readership for those interested in multiple policy areas, like, again, cultural policy, language policy, or urban development policy. For those maybe not interested in theoretical debates about infra-politics or state-society relations, Migdal, etc., they might be interested in just putting some just getting to know some empirics about the urban development policies in Perm, or cultural policies or contesting cultural policies in Tatarstan. So I guess to conclude, our major benefit, the major benefit of the book for me is that it has multiple readerships. Apart from maybe as we aspire as serving as the sort of textbook for those interested in urban and social activism in Russia, students maybe and generally scholars, I think we also might have an interested auditor in terms of policymakers and experts on Russia politics. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much, Regina, Jeremy, and Andrey, for this introduction and to your book and the project. And so next, Margarita will share some of her comments and thoughts on your speeches. Obviously, she hasn't read the book, but in the meanwhile, I would urge you to think of questions that that you would pose to the speakers after Margarita's comments, and then and I said you can write them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and then we'll open your mic. Okay, thanks. So Margarita, please.
Great. So thank you for unmuting me. So first of all, my congratulations on the book. So this is a fantastic endeavor, and it looks like a dream team of the scholars who finally got together, because I've been keeping track on most of these works, despite the fact that I haven't read the book. I'm familiar with the draft versions or some preliminary versions of some of the chapters. Unfortunately, not all of them, and I'm looking forward to reading the whole monograph. So, and I'm very happy that finally different academic gangs or schools, they came together and they came up with this volume. So I think this is a fascinating outcome on its own. So that's the first thing, and not just geographically, just bringing the American scholars together with European and Russian scholars, but it also a fantastic endeavor and collaboration between people working, I mean, with absolutely different methodologies. It's one thing, and the second thing is that this is a collaboration of authors who have not just different perspectives and optics on how they see social movements and current in relation to the current Russian politics and the development of strengthening of authoritarianism in Russia, but also it's very unusual and novel in terms of bringing together the local politics and urban politics perspectives and urban studies perspectives with more or less mainstream political science. So I think this is something that we haven't observed so far. So this is why let me just join the speakers and let me advertise the book. So and I guess I know what I'm advertising. It's maybe I will stop here with the complimentary part. So, and now I will move on, not with the critical part, of course. So Regina is smiling now, but I will continue maybe with another complimentary thing, but it relates not just with the way of how scholars have collaborated together, but with a number of myths about, or some kind of established views about Russian politics and protests and Russian civil societies. And I think this volume really operates as a, as a commando of mythbusters, so to speak. So, and let me just name a few of them, of these myths, which actually I think don't seem to be true anymore. So thanks to the studies that are published in this volume. And the first myth is the most obvious one, is the passivity of the Russian civil society. It's clearly not the case, and I think several chapters, they in the way Regina, Andrey, and Jeremy described it, so clearly shows that it's not true anymore. And this old statement that all post-communist societies are so passive because people were so tired of this communist legacy that they just, don't want to go to these organized state-led marches and demonstrations any longer. That's not true, because first of all, we have a generational change. We have a drastic change in terms of how political processes unfold, and so on and so forth. So Russia in 2029 is very different from even the first attempts to democratize in the early 90s. So we live in different countries. I mean, we are those who actually are resident of Russia. So the second myth is the lack of organizational structures. I think this statement actually has been rotating in academic scholarly for too long. And most of the chapters, they actually kind of shows that it's not the case anymore. And that I really like this, what Jeremy just said about learning through communication. So I think this is a very important thing, because this micro foundation of protests under authoritarian regime, and the highly repressive authoritarian regime, is heavily understated. So, and I would like to draw your attention to this point, because it's something that has been overlooked for too long. And I really like this third myth I would like to emphasize, at least in the way I see it. So it's that the NIMBY activism, not in my backyard activism, is kind of a non-political or apolitical endeavor. So, and we know there is a team of Oleg Zhuravlev and his colleagues who have been writing a lot about that. So, but there is a lot of politics in there. And most of these activists, even if they don't call it politics, they do politics in the reality. And that's the kind of a paradox from the participant or activist perspective, which I find kind of, I find very, I would not funny maybe, but intriguing. So people who do politics, actually, they rarely admit that they do it. So because they feel ashamed of that. But not all of them. And I think after 2014, politics has become less of a dirty thing, less of a dirty business, as it has been, as it had been the case before. So maybe the third myth is that local activism is apolitical. That's not the case. So I think this is something that is clearly shown in the volume. And let me also I recall the paper by Anna Dikalchuk and Ivan Grigoryev. I think it's one of the examples how people do politics even without saying that it's politics. Maybe Anna has a bit, and Ivan have a bit different views on that, but that was my reading. Another important myth, which seems to be ruined, is the fact that all protest politics is done in Moscow or in large cities. That's not the case. So, and the role of local politics, the role of regional politics, even in Tatarstan and places which are known as a very close hegemonic, subnational authoritarian regime, we still observe a lot of important, a lot of, I would say, mobilization, which is very hard to ignore nowadays. So, and lastly, going back to the first myth about the passivity of the Russian civil society. So I would totally agree. The good news is that Russian civil society has learned a lot, but the bad news is that the state, as Andrey has mentioned several times, actually has also learned a lot. And following Mark Basinger's article that was published back in 2005, if I'm not mistaken, about mutual learning of authoritarian regimes and protest movements, is that every subsequent attempt of color revolution or attempt to liberalize and democratize an authoritarian regime, actually they have less odds, less probability of success. It's because the authoritarian leaders, they also learn. And Russian political regime is as repressive as it has never been before. I mean, since the 1993, 1991. So, and maybe this mutual learning doesn't leave much of optimistic prospects for those who are hoping for democratic change. And there is a lot of debate now between, most of the participants here of this seminar. I also was keeping track on the Ponar's discussion about the perspectives of the political change in Russia nowadays, with Navalny's return to the country and his imprisonment. So there are many questions that still have to be answered. So, and I think it's still too early to say that Russia is at the stage of a democratic transition in a classical understanding of this term. But at the same time, it would have been a clear understatement to say that, okay, Russia will remain exactly the same country as has been during the last 5 or 10 years. So that's clearly not the case. We're still observing tectonic changes and quite important changes in the local level. And if just, I would like to draw your attention, it's not in the volume, but I think we can still breach the volume chapters with the current events. We know that regions were extremely active in organizing, in participating in this wave in support of Navalny, and this is something which is quite unusual and something which is very hard to ignore as well. So maybe I just stop here because I have much more to say, but it would be very sad if the audience actually won't have enough opportunity to ask their questions and share their comments. Thank you so much, and my congratulations again. So again, this is a dream team of authors who came up with this volume. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Margarita. So now, would you, Regina, Andrey, and Jeremy, want to respond to Margarita? Have something to specify or?
So I think that Rita's put her finger actually on some of the myths we really hope to sort of address in this book. And I think the answers are really interesting from my perspective, and I'll be really brief. I think one of the things that was most surprising to me is the way these local movements are really transforming social capacity to organize and engage. And you're right that that this isn't a picture of passivity, and it's not a picture of a regression or a withdrawal. It's a picture of people moving into the political space in fits and starts. We are very mindful in this volume. I think Gusel Yusupova's book, Katie's chapter, Irina Limpieva's chapter, all speak to different aspects directly of state repression and how individuals respond to state repression, actually either in terms of engaging in sort of infrapolitics, sort of unrecognizable protest, or standing down, as in the case of co-opted formal trade unions. And I hope that maybe they'll say a few words about their particular perspectives. I do want to also underscore that here you see not only the organization of structure, right, the new infrastructure of local activism, but also, as Jeremy alluded to, new models of repertoire. So we're seeing a really broad range of repertoire that do travel from place to place and become sort of examples, moving across policy spaces and across different questions. So that's sort of my reaction, maybe Jeremy and Andrey.
Yeah, just really briefly, again, thank you very much, Margarita, for that, for really kind of getting to the nub of, I think, these 5 problems, right, that we grapple with, that we all grapple with. Passivity, organizational structure, NIMBY as apolitical, Moscow centrism, state learning, right? And then you finish with that point on tectonics, which I like. I never thought of it in those terms, but again, it's a wonderful metaphor really for what I think some of the authors in this book are showing. So, and I kind of started with this, but using a different kind of language, which is that we focus on Navalny, we focus on violence, we focus on the streets, in Moscow. This is the lava, this is the explosion, this is the volcano, right? But beneath that, we don't spend enough time looking at these very, very small movements, right, that are invisible, okay, a lot of the time. So I really like your use of the word tectonics, yeah. And of course, the point is that tectonics never stand still. Again, the point being that Russia is changing. Russia's changed hugely since, as I said, you know, this kind of watershed where Navalny comes on the scene when on the national scene for fair elections, and then we see perhaps now a further development. And again, you brought that out really nicely, that actually a lot of the moving and the shaking is not necessarily in Moscow, or not only in Moscow, the regional aspect, and that's definitely brought out by our authors. You know, a lot written about the non-metropolitan. So it's urban activism, but it's not just Moscow, St. Petersburg, and repertoire, as Regina just mentioned, new repertoire. And I didn't mention it, but I mean, it's my own hobby horse. Social media, not as just as a platform for organizing protests, you know, come out and support Navalny through Facebook, people talking Facebook, but actually people building substantive networks of trust through their engagement in social media groups. I talk a lot in my chapter about YouTube. YouTube channels being one of the most important political communication phenomena in Russia today. YouTube channels, of course, again, not just Navalny, right? But, you know, there are extremely entrepreneurial, other opposition, you know, politicians using YouTube, including even the Communist Party. Right. So I was just watching a response to the Navalny protests in Moscow, and it was by Saratov, communist deputy, who has 1 million Instagram followers. And so he's clearly, you know, he and many other people are clearly on the scene using social media in ways that the government, you know, cannot effectively counter or control. At the same time, I would just again like to point out that a point that I made, that Margarita referred to, the regime learning. The regime also is incredibly effective in kind of cementing a post-truth environment where it becomes easier and easier to propagate narratives that Navalny is a foreign agent in the literal sense of the word, right? That, you know, these protests are about corrupting the youth, that, as we saw a year or so ago, very, very persuasive and pervasive narrative that foreign embassies have paid young people to protest. You know, people believe this, okay? And we shouldn't, and that is the success of the regime learning about social media as well. I'll stop there.
I guess I'll be brief.
Yeah.
Well, first, thanks, Rita, for the comments. I guess these are very helpful ideas to frame the book. You know, talking about myth breakers and myth busters. I'll just pick one idea from Jeremy and Rita, that actually this metaphor of tectonic, I think, is very important, since the tectonic shifts this is actually indeed a metaphor. We can see eruptions of mobilization over time, which draws the media attention and the politicians' attention. And one of, I think, our aim was to sort of unfold this idea whether some small cracks, etc., contributed to this eruption, or whether it has nothing to do with that. And tectonic changes can be seen only on a granular level and over the long periods of time. And that's what our studies also sort of show, that sometimes really what is held to be certain and what is held to be already sort of installed, like the passivity of Russian society, etc., is actually not there. There are things like unlikely alliances between the state and the activists. There are events that render and change the tracks of the processes, or fail to do that. And so there is much unpredictability and uncertainty in the state-society relations, although we all, like scholars and politicians and citizens, strive for this certainty, but it's not there. And we might find some patterns, but these patterns are also sort of conditional on the methodology and things like that. So I think this is a great idea, and this is a great thing to think about more, whether these tectonic changes are caused by this small scale contention, or sort of they have nothing to do with it.
Okay, great.